Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where every week we shine a light onto the hidden worlds of money and power. This week we have Ed Siddons, a reporter at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism here in London. Ed reported on the affairs of a charitable foundation set up by a allegedly murderous dictator who ruled Kazakhstan for 30 years. The people he was reporting on didn't like what he was writing and subjected him and his colleagues to a 2-year legal battle. So this week, Ed's going to join us and talk to us about what it's like to be sued for your reporting, but also why London has become the center of this global effort to prevent the truth from coming out about dictators and oligarchs and all kinds of other interesting characters. Hello, Ed. Nice to have you at Whale Hunting.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Excellent. So you've just been through a big journey with a lawsuit. Maybe you can just kind of explain what happened to you, what you went through, and then we can talk more about the wild world of libel law here in the UK.
Sure. We've just finished a 2-year-long lawsuit for a story we published in February 2022. The story, in short, was about a UK company which held about £7.8 billion in assets, largely in Kazakhstan, but also in some other jurisdictions. Essentially, we published the story and the company took umbrage with the reporting and decided about 3 months later that they were issuing proceedings. It's been just shy of 2 years, I think. But as of sort of last few weeks, it has settled. The case is now over. We can't sort of discuss the terms of the settlement, but the story is still live and we are, very happy with the conclusion.
Excellent. Although I would say you broke my cardinal rule, which is, as I made this mistake once myself, I said, never write about Kazakhstan. If you write about Kazakhstan, something bad is going to happen at some point or another. And there's no characters in the story that you're going to be rooting for, very likely. That's my own opinion. But I did it one time. I wrote a story about an asset freeze. And then I got so much drama over the story. It was like a 400-word, like almost like a brief.
Yeah.
And there was so much drama over this little story. And it turned out people were making false representations in court and all this stuff. And I said to myself, it's like that scene in China, that movie Chinatown, like, forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. I say the same thing about Kazakhstan, you know? So just stay away from Kazakhstan from now on, okay?
Yeah, I think that is not entirely bad advice if you're trying to avoid lawsuits. Like, I think there's just the political rifts there run really deep. And I think it's not all that difficult to get caught in the crosshairs. I think it's not for the faint-hearted, maybe.
Definitely. It's also just a hard place to really grasp what's going on. But for example, when you did your initial story, one person was in charge and now a different person is in charge, right? How did that change the dynamics? Is there any idea that it did change the dynamics?
Yeah, I guess we sort of speculated on how different things were. There was clearly turmoil in sort of Kazakhstan at the time we published. There had been widespread protests probably a month or two beforehand, which we sort of thought was part of the public interest in publishing the story. But then in the course of litigation, we were being sued, and I shall say that the Telegraph was sued, and so were Open Democracy, and there was an initial attempt to sue OCCRP, the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, who revealed a lot of the stuff, a lot of this in the first place. While all of these various lawsuits were working themselves out, there was then a case that was taken against one of the US arms of this kind of corporate empire that we reported on, essentially making some pretty strong, much stronger than any claim we made in the story. And it was curious to be being sued while the present Kazakh administration were raising similar but much stronger concerns about this corporate nexus.
So you wrote this story, you get the letter. So just explain about, maybe some people who are listening to this are not totally aware of the kind of special way things work here in the UK, especially. Sure. Just maybe explain how these letters work. What are they called? What kind of things do they say about you and your family and your in your life? Yeah. They can get a bit personal sometimes.
Yeah, some of them can get really nasty. In general, you'll work on the investigation. You'll get all your sort of ducks in a row, finish your fact check, and then you'll send your right of reply to whoever it is you're writing about. That is usually the point that you'll get your first legal letter if the person that you're writing about is wealthy enough to afford a libel firm. There's normally an exchange. It can just be a sort of one and done. It can be an exchange before you publish, usually saying, if you do this, fire and brimstone is going to fall upon you, your organization will not survive, that kind of thing. Sometimes they're more explicit, sometimes they're more implicit. But those threats are extremely common, particularly in the UK. But then claims, sort of formal claims initiating litigation are much, much rarer. So then, I mean, we received the initial letter before action that was sort of formally starting proceedings about 3 months after we published. And that is much, much, much less common. Like kind of anyone will have a go before you publish. But it is a much, much smaller subset who will then really, really go for it.
And it's important to note, of course, in America and elsewhere in the world, there are such firms that exist, but there's something different about the UK, right? It comes down to this idea that, as far as I understand it, in the US, in order to prove defamation, you have to prove not only that they got a fact wrong, but that they did it on purpose, what they call malice. And in court, the other side, the burden's on them to prove that you're wrong and that they're right. Whereas here in the UK, there's no such thing as malice. If you get it wrong, you're wrong. And the burden's on you. So especially if you do investigative journalism where you're relying on sources who are putting themselves at risk and you can't identify them. In a court proceeding, you've got two hands and one leg tied behind your back, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason that London gets called the libel capital of the world. As you say, there are certain quirks in English law that mean effectively that the odds are sort of stacked against you as a defendant. I mean, there's a sort of presumption that the allegation published is false, and therefore it stands on you to defend that in cases of sort of running a truth defense. But also, I mean, the lawyers here, there's a kind of cultural difference as well as a sort of technical legal difference. And there's a ferocity to London lawyers that I think doesn't exist in some other jurisdictions. And I mean, I didn't really know that before I reported a story about Carter Ruck, which is sort of one of the oldest firms in the UK specialising in this kind of work. And speaking to kind of people from other news outlets, some European, some American, some kind of scattered across the world, that like in speaking to them, I think it was interesting for me to see, because I've only ever really dealt with UK libel lawyers. Speaking to them, they're like, no, these are some of the world's worst. Like, these are ferocious. They will make kind of extraordinary claims about you, about your reporting, about your integrity. They will pursue you sort of over the smallest detail in a piece. And also, it's just eye-wateringly expensive here. I mean, like, defending a libel case is easily 500 grand. It can be well over $1 million if it gets to full trial. And I mean, yeah, if you look at the sort of wealth disparity between some of the people who take out these suits, and particularly non-profit investigative organizations like ourselves, it's a drop in the ocean to them, and it's a huge resource waste for us. And
it works. I mean, have you, in your discussions with other journalists at newspapers, what has been the effect of this powerful system here in the UK? I mean, when you talk to other people trying to do hard stories, what is the kind of feeling that you hear from people in these newspapers? How much are we not reading because of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to quantify. I think the problem, it's sort of a really difficult problem to get any sort of numbers on, insofar as most of the really egregious stuff happens before publication, and there's no record of it, there's no court file, there's no sort of public proceedings to which you'd have access to any documents. And also, people are pretty coy about the threats that they receive. Like, if, for example, you get a legal threat, your editor doesn't back you, and so you retract part of the story, or you don't publish something, you kind of don't want that known. You don't want to seem, I don't know, in some way cowardly, or that you sort of didn't have receipts for the allegation you were publishing. So it's really hard to tell how widespread a lot of this stuff is. But there's sort of various levels of interference that it introduces to public interest reporting. Like, you've got the stories that are killed in their entirety, of which there are, I think, more than people would like to admit. But then there's also the stories that do get published. I mean, I'd say, most investigative journalists, when they're running stories, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50% of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor, because perhaps you're willing to you're willing to go out to bat for the sort of central allegation, but this small bit, which is maybe slightly more colourful or slightly more speculative, you don't. And so there's the whole gamut from the story dying in its entirety through to like really important details being left out of things.
Yeah. I feel like in my experience with Americans versus British journalists is Americans are always ruining the story they couldn't quite prove. And then British journalists are ruining the story they couldn't quite publish because of this problem, because of the high risk of, anything that doesn't feel absolutely core to a newspaper, they're not going to back it. They're not going to back something that's like important, but not, the most important issue of the day. So there's all this, everything that's not in the center is not maybe getting covered as much. But it's also quite, I know from my own experience, getting these letters is not easy to read through it. I mean, it sounds like scary, right? I mean, is that how you felt looking at your first legal letter? It doesn't feel like this is a minor affair,
For sure. And I think when I was first starting out in Investigate, so most of my investigative work for the first sort of 4 years was in TV. It was sort of doing films for Channel 4 Dispatches and BBC Panorama. And like the first few letters you get, you're terrified by them. Like you're like, oh my God, I've got everything wrong. I'm a terrible journalist. I should never have published this. And then usually you'll have a sort of older editor or director or whoever it is being like, this is part of the course. So when these letters came in, it was very much not, at least in the preliminary letters, there was no sort of immediate fear. We were, I think, fair. We sort of reflected the response in the piece. We did all of the things that responsible journalists do. But getting the letter before claim was something different. I mean, that was an escalation that I hadn't experienced before. I think very few journalists actually deal with sort of formal litigation being opened against them. And initially, it's terrifying. You're sort of thinking, you're not only scared about having gotten things wrong, but also you're kind of scared about what this means for colleagues. Like, does this mean that we are in financial danger? Am I putting myself or anyone else at risk of just how much resources it's going to take? Will editors back you the whole way? Will there be a sort of retraction? Like, all of those things are really scary. Luckily, that wasn't really the situation that I was in at the Bureau. I mean, people were pretty clear from the get-go that like this was not getting retracted unless we were convinced that the facts were materially different as to what we published. So yeah, I mean, initially it's pretty terrifying, but over time you kind of get used to it.
Well, I think the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is obviously a place that knows how to navigate this.
Yeah.
And the problem is that a major newspaper or even a small newspaper is that these letters often really besmirch the reputation of the journalist too. They'll say, this journalist is clearly has an agenda, or they clearly messed up the facts. They don't know what they're doing. They're amateur. We found this other things about them. They really try to sow doubt wherever they can. But one thing that I've learned in my own experience with these letters is that in truth, 98% of them are bluffing, And there's even a great story of Claire Rucastle Brown, who did the Sarawak Report blog. And I once heard her tell somebody in a public setting that she got advice once from a libel law lawyer about what she should do. And he said to her, just throw every single letter you get into the bin. Because if you engage with them, that's where they start to bleed you dry.
Yeah.
But now, of course, major newspapers can't do that. They have to kind of engage, have this proof of the exchange of letters that we tried to correct if there was an error. But in reality, that it's actually kind of an alternative approach, and it seems to have worked for her because she also wasn't sued in any of her coverage in 1MDB.
But I think there's the sort of throw these letters in the bin approach, but there's also the approach of sort of pure publicity. Like, I think very early on, there were discussions among the senior edit team, which effectively decided that, okay, if you want to sue us, this whole thing will be public. Like, we will go public about this claim. We will go public about any issue we can go public on. Any document that's put into the public record, we will report on if it's in the public interest and we think that readers will care. Like, at each stage of this, and there were times when I was pretty worried about that. I was like, this is quite a lot to be doing. But I think ultimately people don't want the kind of scrutiny that I guess campaigning around the lawsuit you're in brings. And I think it also it sort of shapes who sues you and who doesn't sue you. So like, it's pretty rare, I think, for publicly listed companies to go after journalists in a kind of formal litigation way. They'll send threats. Everyone will send threats. But it looks pretty terrible to be going after individual journalists or small organizations, particularly like small nonprofits. But yeah, it is. There are many different ways to deal with a lawsuit, and in retrospect, although I think at times it was slightly nail biting, I'm really glad that we were open about stuff, that we could tell our readers about it, and that we could, raise awareness for what it actually means and precisely how much time has to go into it. That I think is the thing that still rankles with me. It's the sheer number of hours that responding to those letters, that preparing a defense, that all of these things took. Like, that's time you don't get back, and it's time that I couldn't spend on other stories. And that, I think, is what still really irritates me.
Yeah. Well, I think there's also a sense that some of these firms have really gotten away from even what's appropriate for reputation, whatever they want to call it, protection or privacy protection. You know, in the for Billion Dollar Whale, they not only threatened to sue like you would do, saying this is defamation of Joe Low, who, by the way, is not living in London. He was wanted on a red notice, Interpol red notice, but they were working for him. They were being paid in the most obscure way. That would, in my opinion, was like completely inappropriate. They were being paid by this other party in Kuwait who claimed that it was all his money. Later, it turned out in Kuwait it was not his money. Jolo was sending the money to them.
Right.
But they said, not only did they say, okay, we're gonna sue you till kingdom come about this book, but they said they sent letters to all the bookshops, all the bookshops around the world, and like little bookshops, big bookshops, saying, we will sue you because you're now a publisher, because you carried on your website a advertisement saying that you're going to publish this book and you summarized the book. Therefore, you're the publisher. And so there's so many funny stories where some guy in Australia got it and he just like thought it was a joke and threw it away. They were especially concerned about the Hong Kong airport bookshop, and they were hand delivering a letter every few hours ahead of publication. Like, you have 3 hours left, you have 2 hours left, you have 1 hour left, you know? And it was just ludicrous. But this is a good example of how they actually totally messed this up for their client. Because if their goal was to protect his reputation, they only made it worse. Because this is what they call the Streisand effect, right? The more you do that kind of thing, the more everyone's like, oh, wow, this is interesting. You know, and the book or the article gets more credit and more eyes on it because they're trying to prevent it from happening. So this particular law firm, which rhymes with trilling, managed to get millions and millions and millions of pounds from Jolo, only to make his plight so much worse. You know, so that's actually also, for anybody who's considering hiring such a firm, I would rethink your strategy. Because if you have a problem with a journalist or an article, you're much better off like having a conversation or kind of shifting it, or you know, not going straight to legal letters, because everyone's position hardens at that point, and nobody wants to move anymore because now lawyers are involved. You know,
but there's always been, I think, this. It's strange receiving some of the letters, and I mean, some of them are completely feral, because I think there's this sense like this will really scare them, and yet the sort of more bluster you see in a legal letter, the less mind you pay it. Like, the point is that we know that you're doing this and you want to look robust to your client, but if you have no substantive claims within that piece, you have no factual rebuttal of what we're reporting, then of course it's going to be ignored. And I think there's always this. I mean, perhaps they know that a gentler approach works, but they just don't want to seem, you know, meek and mild to their client. But I would be much more concerned to receive a call from, you know, the subject of our reporting saying, you know, I'm really sorry, but I think you've got these things wrong for the following reasons, and to lay out very clearly what the issues are. I have no interest in publishing information that's incorrect. I think very few journalists do. And the idea that you would immediately try and go nuclear in an attempt to intimidate is it's both unpleasant, and it makes the entire thing, you know, much more unpleasant than it needs to be, but it's also really ineffective a lot of the time, at least when you're dealing with places that you know, have pedigree in dealing with these sorts of threats.
Exactly. If I was a very rich person who had a problem with a newspaper, I would send a polite letter. I would not send a shillings letter, because that's basically saying I'm a James Bond villain, and this is what James Bond villains do. They send these letters that are like extremely aggressive, you know, suggesting that the newspaper is engaging in something that's not journalism. You know, it's best way to start off is assume that they're trying to do their job, you know. in the last few years, there seems to be more discussion around what's called slaps.
Yeah.
Maybe you can explain what that is, and what is there anything changing with regards to this?
Yeah, so I mean, slaps are strategic lawsuits against public participation, something of a mouthful. But essentially, it is kind of excessive or abusive litigation designed to shut down, for example, investigative journalists or campaigners. There's been a real movement around this, particularly in the last few years. I think the sort of most immediate precursors were a consortium of oligarchs suing Catherine Belton for her excellent book, Putin's People, but also Tom Burgess getting sued for his book, Kleptopia. I think that sort of put it on the agenda. And then some pretty spicy legal letters that were sent to former tax lawyer, now tax campaigner, Dan Needle, which he went extremely public with. I think that really sort of set the tone. And it seemed, I think, particularly in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to become an issue that politicians finally thought there was some kind of political capital in. And so we saw attempts at reform. You know, there have been amendments in legislation passed which provide some relatively minimal protections for reporting on economic crime, for example, which for me is really helpful, for other journalists perhaps less so. But there hasn't been anything that sort of fundamentally righted the balance of these things. You know, the legislation that has passed will be helpful for those reporting on economic crime. It will not be helpful for those reporting on sexual violence or war crimes or all manner of other wrongdoing that doesn't sort of fall under that specific heading. But I mean, the central problems with UK libel system, namely that our law is pretty favourable to claimants, and secondly, that it is eye-wateringly expensive and means that effectively some people can't pay to play. Those things haven't changed. And also it doesn't look like they're going to. I mean, the political will that did exist within the previous administration, I mean, this hasn't been raised as an issue in the King's Speech. I don't know whether Keir and the Labour Party have, the will to push things through with any matter of priority. But I think it's important. I think it's really important.
You know, in some ways, this industry of law firms it reminds me of that Oliver Bullough book, Butler to the World, you know, sort of thing. Yeah. So I'm not sure if that's the right title, but it is a very nice service to provide people who are very rich who want to base themselves here or have assets here. And so I think that's always what's kind of going against this is if we change this, are more and more of these high net worth people going to relocate somewhere else that has a better, you know, privacy protections. And that's what that's what they like it to say is this is about privacy. It just happens to be that the privacy that they're trying to maintain is about, in many cases, where they got their money from. It may be criminal, it may be corrupt, it may be unseemly, you know, and people want to keep that private. So that's privacy. But what's private is often in the public interest. Yeah.
And I'd say two things in response to that. I spoke to somebody who works at another sort of non-profit network of investigative journalists who was explaining the sort of abject fury that he feels when he receives letters from people who have no real tie to the UK. Their only tie to the UK is the fact that they enrich themselves in their home country and then use their ill-gotten funds to buy an apartment in Knightsbridge or to send their child to one of the big public schools. And effectively what they've done is commit a crime in some instances, use the proceeds of that crime to anchor themselves in London, and therefore grant themselves jurisdiction to, I guess, weaponize the UK legal system against any of their critics, whether those critics are in the UK or not. And I mean, this question of jurisdiction is one we haven't really dealt with, but in the long piece I wrote for The Economist about sort of Carter Ruck and the libel industry, one of the things that's terrifying to me is that the threats of UK libel lawyers very much do not stay within the UK's boundaries. I mean, if you're writing about anyone in the world who is rich enough, they probably have some sort of property in the UK and London. And that grants them access to this system, which is very claimant friendly, which is so expensive that it can intimidate people out of fighting cases and all of that sort of stuff. And I think, speaking to this reporter in particular, he was explaining that just the irony of being shut down from reporting on someone's corruption because of the proceeds of that corruption giving them access to UK libel lawyers is a pretty bitter pill to swallow, I think.
Yeah, imagine that you're somebody, in the case of Joe Low, who stole $6 billion and he's funding all of these lawyers with that money. It's completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
Now, every person should have a right to a lawyer, right? But it's hard to set the limit. So if a right to a lawyer means you can spend $100 million on lawyers, it feels like something's not quite right, you know? And very infrequently does anybody go after lawyers, even for infringements. Yeah. You know, if they didn't follow the anti-money laundering provision in order to receive the money, no one's ever really arresting lawyers, you know? So lawyers get away with a lot, that's for sure. But I do wonder if life inside of these firms is actually kind of like darkly comedic. Like I always think of like the thick of it, where they must be talking a lot of shit about their clients among each other and laughing about how much money they're making. But this is not a career for believers, you know, or people who are on a kind of a bigger mission, right?
So, but this is the interesting thing, I guess. Reporting on Carter Rock for The Economist with co-reporter Matthew Valencia, we spoke to former lawyers from Carter Rock, but also people who've been inside all of the big firms, you know, Schillings, Mishcon, various others. And some of them are real diehard. We believe that what we are doing is right because everybody has the right to reputation, they have a right to a private life, they have a right to all of these things. And I think they very militantly believe in the justice of what they're doing on a really principled level. I think there are others who don't really care and they make great money and it's more interesting than some of the more arcane parts of law. You get to have big ding-dongs with the press. You know, it is what it is. They don't really see themselves in particularly moral terms. And then there's the other subset of people who feel icky in what they're doing. Like perhaps they, you know, don't particularly feel that sending extremely aggressive letters on behalf of X warlord or Y dictator is a particularly good use of their time. And some of them leave and some of them go into defense work. But some of them also just sort of ride it out because the money's not bad. I mean, I also would say that like there are many instances where these firms, I mean, particularly Carter Rock, you know, one of the cases they took out was against the News of the World, who I think had accused a mechanic who had seemingly done nothing wrong other than being Muslim of being a terrorist financing expert. And I mean, it was completely egregious. And yeah, I think the News of the World got what was coming to them. And I think this is perhaps a source of frustration among some of the libel lawyers that it's all well and good for me to sit here and, you know, bemoan how difficult it is as a sort of small non-profit working on investigations that are getting these letters. But it is also the case that the UK tabloids are completely feral on certain issues. They have defamed and ruined the lives of, a number of people who have done nothing wrong. And it is important that those people have redress. And so it is... I think the picture is slightly more complicated than perhaps some people allow, but it doesn't change the fact that much of this work, the ultimate effect of it, is to remove things from the public domain, which are clearly in the public interest.
Yeah, so there's something out of proportion. There's something skewed here. Of course, you're right. Everyone has a right to redress, or if they feel like something was wrong, and then the paper didn't give them a proper process, then of course they need to have some way to go. But it should be the rarity rather than straight to this is the worst journalist I've ever come across in my life and they're clearly out to destroy my client, you know. I think it's a bit ludicrous.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I've always found interesting is the degree to which libel lawyers will defame you in the letters that they respond with. So, for example, at the Bureau, we co-publish, so we've done stories with the Sunday Times, with the Guardian, with the Observer, US outlets, etc. And in some of the letters that have been sent in response to, you know, the sort of allegations that I put to them, they've then CC'd everyone on the senior edit team at the Bureau. They've also CC'd the managing editor of the Sunday Times or Telegraph or whoever it might be, talking about the truly reprehensible and completely egregious things that I'm attempting to publish. And there's part of me which, you know, you sort of trust in the fact that an editor at any of these newspapers should know that the allegation, that kind of tone of response is almost always bluster. And so you hope that it doesn't kind of damage your standing with them. But also it's like, these are people who are potentially your future employers. They're people who are important to your future career, and they're receiving letters written by libel lawyers accusing you of being unfair to somebody while also painting the most sort of cartoonishly villainous portrait of you as a reporter that they possibly can. And I don't know, I think you just kind of sit there and think, like, are you serious? Are you really sending this letter to the editor of whatever institution it might be, talking about me as though I've personally engineer the downfall of your client who accidentally got involved in huge state corruption in X country in Y year. I find it kind of extraordinary.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of funny things that happen too, because even these legal letters, they seemingly are a one-way street. They're just attacking you. But as soon as they start to engage, they open themselves up to actually ending up confirming your story. So there's been times when I've had this exchange of letters and they were so detailed in their initial critique that when I went back with a detailed response to that critique, they couldn't then not respond to the detailed response. And so as a result, I felt more secure than ever about the story. So they played an unlikely role of being a source, one of my great regrets in life is that I didn't sue Schillings myself for tortious interference, because they were sending letters to bookshops saying it was against the law, or that they were publishers, right? But the law specifically says you sue the publisher of the book. You don't sue the bookshop. It says in very clear words. So they really were misrepresenting the law to these bookshops. And some, including Amazon, briefly took the book down from amazon.co.uk because they got the letter. So I would have loved to sue Schillings for tortious interference. It's one of my great regrets in life.
But it's also, I think, a sort of mismatch between the legislation and the reality in which people live now. Like, a publisher 50 years ago mostly did mean a sort of newspaper or a magazine or whatever it might be. And yet now you have people receiving these really heavy-handed legal threats on the basis of tweets or appearances on a YouTube channel. I mean, there was one person that I interviewed, Jen McAdam, who was initially sort of taken in by the OneCoin scam, and then later turned sort of campaigner on all of the, I think it was about $2 billion of fraud that the DOJ now accuses it of. But I mean, she ended up receiving a legal letter from Carter Ruck on the basis of a video that had been uploaded to YouTube because of things that someone else had said on the podcast. Most members of the public do not have an intimate knowledge of UK media law. They're not thinking about privacy law, about data protection, about libel, all of these things which are rapidly evolving and often extremely complex. And yet, technically now, they can be caught as publishers. And I think that is a radical expansion of the scope as to who kind of constitutes fair game for this stuff. And I think this is part of the reason why it matters. And it's part of the reason that I spent about 2 years reporting the Carter Ruck story, because the people that we found who'd been on the end of receiving letters, and it's very much not just Carter Ruck, it's true of any firm doing claimant work, there was everyone from sitting MPs to academics to universities to individual whistleblowers to people who, like Jen McAdam, were of really modest means, who didn't know the first thing about responding to a legal letter. I think there's a point when you look at those cases where, why are those people fair game? It is a very, very different state of affairs to be writing a letter like that to, the Daily Mail, to the Telegraph, to the Sun, to the Guardian, whoever it might be, a place with resources. Doing that to somebody with a blog or a Twitter account is, it's a very different opponent, and yet the tactics don't seem to change.
Yeah, exactly. And those guys are likely to just delete everything as soon as possible rather than actually contest it, even if they're completely right.
And there is a kind of element. I spoke to somebody and put this to them, and they themselves are a media lawyer, but a defense lawyer largely. And they were sort of saying, if it comes to the point that you are sending letters to individuals that prevent them airing allegations that are credible about wrongdoing, particularly criminal wrongdoing, in which there then goes on to be a criminal investigation, to what extent are you not an enabler? Are you complicit for the initial fraud? No, you're not. But are you in some way preventing the detection of that? And I think there is a case to be made that you are. If you're silencing allegations that might put other people off from investing in this fraudulent scheme, that's quite a serious, morally as well as professionally, I think there are really serious questions to answer there.
We jumped straight into this topic in the very beginning, but you just reminded me now that this has been your big project, right? The enablers at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And I imagine that the letters you received about your work on Kazakhstan suggested that you were getting things wrong on purpose and all kinds of other terrible things. Since maybe we're going to have some libel lawyers listening, could you explain about how you didn't get into journalism to get things wrong about Kazakhstan? What was your actual journey into becoming a reporter?
So I graduated in God, a while ago, and just started like freelancing. I'd been involved in student papers, I'd written bits and pieces, but I didn't go through the sort of, I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist at age 4. I wasn't writing newspapers for my parents, that kind of thing. But essentially I freelanced for a while. I sort of worked in-house at a couple of places and then ended up getting on the Channel 4 Dispatches training scheme, which was amazing. But I mean, I fundamentally got into this kind of reporting rather than, some of the kind of culture reporting that I was doing as a freelancer, to sort of shine a light on stuff that was patently wrong and that wasn't being covered elsewhere. And I think that is mostly what we've done at the Bureau. I mean, it's in some ways it's quite a specific, and in some ways it's quite a general beat. The sort of stuff we do work on is primarily about the middlemen who enable or facilitate oligarchs, dictators, organised criminals. So largely that's been shining a light on the City of London, particularly on its lawyers, on its bankers, its PR people, and the sort of shady world of corporate investigators, which I know is something you are also interested in. Yeah, I don't think I understood prior to this job precisely how much work the City of London does on behalf of some extremely unsavoury characters.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what's some of the work that you've been doing most recently? Is there anything you can talk about, or some of the work at the Bureau?
I had the big Kazakh story back in December, which sort of gives a long, very long 800-year history to the kind of libel industry as it stands today. And we have a series of projects coming, some of which are on similar topics that we discussed today, around libel law, around silencing, around the stories that don't quite make press. So yeah, stay tuned for autumn.
Excellent. And if anybody here is feeling guilty about the use of libel lawyers, can they donate to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism to sort of sustain the spotlight on enablers?
How kind of you to mention. Yeah, I mean, we are a small nonprofit and donations are very, very welcome. So yeah, I mean, you can look at our past reporting. I've worked at various places over the years, and I don't think I've worked anywhere that is more courageous than the Bureau. And yeah, for all of the stress and for all of the unpleasantness that there has been in the last 2 years being sued, I sort of couldn't have asked for more robust support from them. So yeah, a moment of earnest gratitude to my bosses. But yeah, I mean, become a member of the Bureau, donate to us, read Brazen, read similar outlets. Like, keep an eye on these issues. Like, they're not going away. And I think for all of the excellent reporting in the last few years about the role of the City of London, particularly in sort of facilitating the Russian oligarchs, it is the tip of the iceberg. And there are many more stories to come.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week. Thank you to Ed for joining us. If you're enjoying whale hunting, please go online and sign up for our newsletter as well. We've got a lot of interesting content there that you don't find in the podcast, including our famous Weekender, which is a roundup of the best writing, podcasts, documentaries, films, TV shows that we find every week. You can find it at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week for more.
That's it for this week, and thanks for listening. The best way to stay up to date with whale hunting is to hit follow wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the Whale Hunting newsletter for updates on the shadowy lives of the powerful and ultra-wealthy at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. That's whalehunting.projectbrazen.com. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.